I discovered my wife's affair the day she was admitted to the hospital. Years later, she cannot accept that I have moved on, and I got promoted at work, which meant more money, but also more traveling for work conferences and business meetings. I noticed she was more depressed and not as intimate as before, kept her phone close, and even stopped addressing things that bothered her gently. I tried talking to her about it, but she assured me she was fine, and that it was just a phase she was going through, and I had no reason not to trust her, so I let it go. Sometimes she would go to her sister's house and spend the night, saying she just needed some time with her sister. The day I received that fateful phone call was supposed to be when she was accompanying her sister again. I remember running to the hospital, barely breathing and frantically asking for my wife when the most understanding and patient police officer in the world made me sit down to explain what had happened. He said he was a friend of my sister-in-law and had responded to a domestic disturbance call. He arrived at the scene to find a couple fighting. The boyfriend was supposed to be on top of the woman, hitting her, and she was screaming, trying to scratch him. This made no sense to me because 1, it had nothing to do with my wife as she was married to me, and 2, literally, everyone who knew my wife knew she would never be capable of cheating on me. He looked at me seriously, put his hand on my shoulder, and then told me that the supposed girlfriend was actually my wife. If it weren't for the gravity of the situation, I would have laughed in his face, but something in the way he said it made me believe him. Then, a nurse led me to see my wife, and what I felt that day was indescribable. I just stood there for what felt like an eternity, and then a doctor came and explained her injuries. Her jaw was slightly fractured, her left eye was completely swollen, and she had massive bruises covering half of her face, as well as 3 broken ribs. Then, the doctor dropped another bombshell. She was pregnant. I still couldn't understand when it happened, but then I saw her sister. At first, she tried to avoid contact with me, but persuaded by her police friend, she told me what she knew. Turns out, my wife's ex had reached out to her 5 months earlier. He was doing this redemption thing, apologizing to people he had wronged to cleanse his karma. Anyone else sensing a red flag at this point? They started talking more, and he eventually convinced her to meet for coffee and show her he was a changed man. Obviously, old feelings resurfaced, with the premise that he was different now, and it soon turned into a romantic affair 3 months later. In fact, she told my wife that she should at least make amends with her ex somehow, and offered to cover for her occasionally so she could meet him. My sister-in-law was crying at this point, apologizing over and over to me, saying she knew nothing about the abuse, as my wife never told anyone except me and her therapist at the time. I was numb. I just couldn't feel anything and was absolutely amazed